The first defection, how Mark Carney turned Canadian prudence into geopolitical dissent. For decades, Canada's foreign policy has resembled its climate, cool, predictable, and politely deferential to its southern neighbor. It specialized in incrementalism, not insurgency, in managing American excess, not confronting it. That tradition ended when Mark Carney decided, in public and at scale, to treat the United States not as a difficult ally but as a structural liability. His intervention at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos was not merely a speech. It was a declaration of strategic adulthood. Canada would no longer organize its future around American volatility. In the language of polite diplomacy. This was revolutionary. The significance lies not in Carney's rhetoric, which was sharp but restrained, but in what it implied. He treated Washington not as temporarily misguided but as institutionally unreliable. In doing so, he placed Canada at the front of a quiet revolt among America's allies, one that may yet redraw the architecture of Western power, the abusive partner problem. Great powers rarely notice when their allies begin to flinch. Habit dulls perception. For most of the post-war era, America's dominance was cushioned by competence. Its partners tolerated occasional arrogance because the system worked. That assumption has collapsed. Under Donald Trump, coercion replaced coordination. Tariffs substituted for treaties. Threats became policy. Even the language of annexation, once confined to history books, re-entered respectable discourse. For smaller states, this was not merely unpleasant. It was existential. Carney's metaphor, implicit rather than stated, was domestic rather than diplomatic. Canada, like an abused spouse, had concluded that endurance was no longer prudence. Leaving would be costly. Staying would be corrosive. Such moments are rare in international politics. They occur only when uncertainty becomes more dangerous than disruption. Speaking truth in a system of lies, Carney framed his defiance in moral rather than merely economic terms, invoking Václav Havel's analysis of how decaying systems sustain themselves through ritualized dishonesty. Power, Havel observed, depends less on repression than on participation in obvious falsehoods. Trumpism has perfected this model. It functions through exaggeration, denial, and performative grievance. Allies are expected to nod politely while policies mutate hourly and facts dissolve on contact with social media. Carney declined. By calling the American order hegemonic and unworkable, he performed the simplest, and rarest, act in politics. He contradicted a lie in public. More importantly, he did so without being immediately punished. That, in Havel's framework, is how systems begin to unravel. The theater of retaliation. Washington's response was predictably theatrical. On Truth Social, Mr. Trump announced that Canada was no longer welcome in his improvised Board of Peace, a curious assemblage featuring Belarus, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, and Egypt. This gesture revealed more than it concealed. Exclusion was meant as punishment, it functioned as parody. None of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council participated. Canada lost nothing of substance, but the episode illustrated a deeper problem. American diplomacy had become performative rather than strategic. It rewarded loyalty theatrically and punished dissent symbolically. For partners accustomed to predictability, this was intolerable. The anatomy of entanglement, if Canada can contemplate disengagement. It is not because interdependence is shallow. It is because it is dangerously deep. The two economies are welded together by supply chains, regulatory harmonization, and habits. The United States absorbs most Canadian exports and supplies the bulk of its imports. Labor, tourists, and capital cross the border with minimal friction. Air defense is jointly managed through NORAD. Administrative systems overlap like geological strata. This intimacy once guaranteed stability. It now amplifies risk. When American policy swings violently, Canada absorbs the shock. Tariffs become inflation. Sanctions become shortages. Political tantrums become logistical nightmares. What once looked like resilience increasingly resembles fragility. Disentanglement, therefore, is not ideological. It is actuarial. Europe, China, and the search for adult partners, Carney's answer is diversification, economic, diplomatic, and institutional. The centerpiece is deeper integration with the European Union, whose regulatory stability and market scale offer a partial substitute for American demand. Brussels is slow, legalistic, and maddening. It is also predictable. For governments traumatized by impulsive superpowers, predictability is priceless. At the same time, Ottawa has signaled pragmatic engagement with China, despite ideological discomfort. This is not affection. It is hedging. In a world where America cannot be relied upon, moral purity becomes a luxury. The more speculative idea, Canadian association with the EU, illustrates how radically assumptions have shifted. Geography, once destiny, is now negotiable. The domino theory, reversed, American power has long rested less on force than on deference. Allies adjusted their policies in anticipation of Washington's preferences. They complied in advance. Carney's intervention challenges that reflex. If Canada can absorb retaliation and survive, others may follow. Middle powers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America are watching closely. Should they conclude that independence is affordable, American leverage will erode without a shot being fired. Power, in this sense, is reputational. Once doubt spreads, it compounds. The United States risks discovering that influence, like credit, evaporates fastest after it is first questioned. Dollars, data, and the illusion of permanence. America still commands formidable assets. The dollar dominates global finance. Most foreign exchange transactions pass through it. Central banks hoard it. Sanctions weaponize it, but these advantages depend on trust. Recent growth has been uneven, speculative, and heavily dependent on artificial intelligence enthusiasm. Wealth has concentrated. Infrastructure has aged. Politics has radicalized. The gap between financial dominance and social cohesion has widened. History suggests that monetary supremacy rarely collapses overnight. It erodes slowly, then suddenly. Sterling once seemed eternal. 2. Canada's recalibration reflects an early recognition of this trajectory. From prudence to principle, Canadian foreign policy has traditionally been allergic to drama. It prized mediation over confrontation, consensus over clarity. Carney has altered that tradition by introducing a moral dimension. Some relationships, however lucrative, become strategically untenable. This is not romanticism. It is institutional self-preservation. By redefining reliability as the primary criterion of partnership, Carney has turned moderation into dissent. In doing so, he has offered other democracies a template: disengage not in anger, but in anticipation. Conclusion: the quiet revolt. Revolutions in international politics rarely announce themselves. They begin with speeches that sound technical, with policies that look temporary, with adjustments described as pragmatic. Carney's Davos intervention fits this pattern. It was framed as realism. It functioned as rupture. Canada, long the model of subordinate stability, has become the first major Western ally to treat America's political volatility as a permanent risk rather than a passing phase. That judgment, once made, cannot be unmade. If others follow, the American century will not end in catastrophe. It will end in indifference, and that, for an empire built on admiration as much as power, may prove the most devastating outcome of all.